we've got Robert this week, who is going to talk you through an introduction to philosophy. So over to you, Robert.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to the next session on Discovery Program. Today we're going to talk about philosophy. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this discipline, whether you had any philosophy classes of your own before. Today I will try to make it a short introduction to the discipline as a whole, so that you know what the philosophy is dealing with in general. But since the discipline is at least 3,000 years old and has so many great minds dealing with it, we cannot cover all of philosophy. So we're going to focus on a very particular philosophical dilemma, which is called the trolley problem. I think you all are familiar with it by now from the pre-session exercises that you did. And the trolley problem is obviously a theoretical scenario from which, however, we can derive several more principles that we will try to discuss. Also, it's becoming increasingly practical of a problem, especially with the recent rise in self-driving vehicles, cars, and so on. So this is the outline for today. I understand that you cannot really ask any questions by speaking up, but you can put them in the chat. So if you have any questions as I speak, please do put them in the chat. I will try to check them as we go along. Okay, so let's start. The philosophy itself, let's start with the name. The word philosophy comes from a combination of two Greek words, as most things in science do. One is philo, which means a love of something, and the other is sophia, which means a knowledge or wisdom. So that's combines into the love of wisdom in Greek. So in the same way that the biology, for instance, this deals with all things that concern life, philosophy deals with the things that concern wisdom or the knowledge that we have. There are a couple of ways we can divide philosophy because it's such a vast discipline. It has its branches, as basically every discipline, in the same way that physics has a quantum physics and astrophysics and so on. Philosophy also has its branches. Those can be divided in probably several different ways. I think that the four-way division that I'm going to present to you does quite a good job of this. So first is metaphysics. And metaphysics literally means, once again from Greek, that is beyond the physical. So it's the study of reality itself and deals with topics such as existence, being. At this point, you might recall the famous phrase by Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." I fully recommend to you that you read a whole short book that Descartes wrote about the subject from which this famous quote comes from. It's called The Meditations on the Principles of the First Philosophy. And the book starts with Descartes apparently sitting down one afternoon and giving himself a task of doubting everything he seems to know. He starts doubting that there are external objects, that his senses tell him the truth. He starts doubting whether there are other people, other things like trees or horses that exist. He starts even to doubt whether he has any body. And in the end, he comes to the conclusion that although everything can be put into doubt, the sheer fact that he's asking the questions makes at least one thing certain, namely that he himself exists. Therefore, the famous quote. So that's a metaphysical question par excellence. But also metaphysics deals with concepts like time and space and cause and effect relationships. So how do we know that one thing actually leads to another? Can we think of some counterfactual scenario in which that cause and effect relationship doesn't obtain? Can we expect that to persist into the future? A different track to which one person is tied. And the question is whether you pull a lever or not. I'm not sure to what extent you have considered this problem before, for instance, during the pre-session exercises. However, I wanted to start by quickly putting out a very basic questionnaire in the chat. So in chat, I will put those two options, whether you pull a lever or not, do nothing. And if you have access, if you have the ability, could you just react in some way to this message so that I can easily count the reactions and see which choice do you prefer? I will give you a second to do that. And then we can see how it compares with other polling, and that has been going on for years now on this very issue. Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple of interesting options, including close your eyes and ignore it. And that's a choice. It's hard for me to count right now because the responses are coming in quite quickly. But I think it's much closer to a tie than I expected. Quite a few responses definitely that doing nothing is the better one, better choice. Actually, many large-scale surveying exercises on this issue find that most people decide to pull the lever. So in this particular case, there were 4 million respondents, and 72% of people agreed with the choice that I selected here, in this case, pulling the lever. We will see closer to the end of the session that cross-country surveying, so asking the same question to people living in different countries, in different cultures, actually leads to relatively consistent estimates, at least when people are presented with this quite basic scenario of the trolley problem. So how do we decide which decision to take? For any of those of you who decided to pull the lever, I think some of you even put this reasoning in writing in the chat. The reason was that in one case, we are saving 5 human lives. In the other, we are saving just 1. And obviously, saving 5 is larger than 1, so it's better to save 5 than 1. And this line of reasoning brings us to the school of philosophy that's called utilitarianism. Its modern conceptualization dates back to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, 2 British philosophers living in 18th and 19th century. And for this school of thought, the basic idea of judging whether something is good or not is by evaluating what consequences it brings. There is nothing inherently good or bad, moral or immoral in the act itself. What matters is the consequences that the act brings. And quite simply put, when an action brings more good than bad, then this one should be chosen. Utilitarian philosophers are perhaps closest to the mathematicians in the sense that they are trying to strip down the difficult moral questions to numbers as much as it's possible. So if you can put a numerical value on some action and on the consequence of some action, you can measure its utility. Utility is a term that philosophers, but also economists employ. It's just a fancy name of calling something good, of something of some benefit. So in the best case scenario, you can assign then how good an action is, how good are its consequences, and you can do a similar exercise for the second action, and you can compare the two. If one action brings more net good than bad than the other one, then this one should be chosen. In the trolley problem, in the very basic version, you have 5 human lives that you can save if you pull the lever, or you have 1 life that you can save if you decide not to pull the lever. And if that's the inequality that we are faced with, then obviously 5 is greater than 1, so we should select the one that saves 5 lives, meaning pulling the lever. However, we can problematize it, because although in this abstract sense, if you are only faced with this problem once and you don't have to deal in real life with the repercussions that it might have, the first inequality might be the one to be guided by. However, in real life, if you were faced with this choice and you decided to pull the lever, saving 5, but sacrificing 1, then you might be feeling some guilt afterwards. You might feel bad with yourself, which would be a bad thing, and that would detract from the benefits, from the good of the action that you did. Also, you might be establishing a precedence. So if other people were to learn about your choice, they may infer that it is, in some cases, justifiable to sacrifice 1 life to save the 5. And although in normal life we are not faced with decisions of such gravitas, some people in position of power might be. For instance, is it moral to torture someone, say a suspected terrorist, to prevent a mass-scale terror attack? Well, if there is a precedence for that, if we know that in some cases it's justifiable to sacrifice 1 life to save the 5, then perhaps torturing someone, not taking their life, but very much destroying it, to save thousands of lives, that also might be justifiable, according to this principle at least. However, in most Western societies, and I hope you agree with me, that's not a sufficient justification to actually torture someone. That's written in our laws. That's the principles that we are guided by. So there must be something more to this inequality, or perhaps the precedence, the negative side of things, the setting of a precedence that it's sometimes justifiable to sacrifice 1 to save the many. That's negative enough to justify us doing nothing in the trolley problem and just allowing the train to run its course. Another take on this is that if we're dealing with human lives, then we cannot really assign mathematical, numerical value to it. Human life is basically infinitely valuable. And that's so, if that's the highest possible value of infinite utility, then 5 times infinity is not really greater than 1 times infinity. They are basically equal. So that wouldn't allow us to justify the choice of pulling the lever. So whereas utilitarianism can also be assigned to this broader school of thinking about moral principles called consequentialism, where we judge actions only by their consequences, without saying anything in principle about whether a particular action is right or wrong. It can be contrasted with a second approach to the subject that can be termed deontology. And in this approach, the nature of an action itself matters. So going back to the example from a couple of minutes ago, the act of torturing is wrong in itself. It doesn't matter why you do it, whether you do it out of spite or for some higher good. The act itself is wrong, therefore it shouldn't be allowed or tolerated. Both schools of thought, consequentialism and deontology, can be dated back thousands of years ago. Like many philosophers made similar arguments across many different cultures. However, in its modern conception, just as utilitarianism can be dated back to Bentham and John Stuart Mill, deontology can be dated back to Immanuel Kant, who was one of the most important forefathers of the modern school of deontology. And he formulated in one of his splendid books the principle of categorical imperative. What does that mean? Well, it's summarized on the slide and means that you shall only act according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law, meaning you should refrain from doing anything that you wouldn't like others to do unto you. So you can also see that similar principle can be found, for instance, in the Bible. It's a very simple principle, but it's also quite powerful. So you should not say steal. You should not steal because you wouldn't like to be stolen from. So yeah, thou shalt not steal is the law that should be universal and applied to everyone. However, it also allows us to be consistent in our moral attitudes in some more controversial cases. Say, could the destruction of public property during protests be justified? Well, if you are the one that's protesting against some controversial law and you and your supporters are destroying some public property to show your disapproval of the policies that are being introduced, then you might think that, well, okay, maybe that's my law. That's my moral right to do this because I live in a democratic society and I can express my anger over policies that I deem unjust. However, if you employ this line of reasoning, you should also ask yourself, should it be a universal law? And that means that if people from the other side of the political spectrum were protesting against the policies that you actually support, and they were destroying public property, do they have the right to do it or not? And in the light of categorical imperative, your answer should be consistent. So either this is the right of people who are protesting against perceived injustices, or it is not, and it should apply equally to everyone. So consequentialism versus deontology is one way to approach the trolley problem. Either we judge the consequences of an action, and in this case, we value whether leading to a death of 5 people versus leading to a death of 1 is better or not, and why. Or we can also think about the nature of the action itself. So actually causing the train to divert to the track to kill 1 person can be bad, and therefore it should refrain from that. This links to a different view on the subject, because we can look not only on the consequences versus the nature of action itself, we can also look at positive versus negative duties. So according to most moral philosophers, people have a set of duties that are positive, meaning that we have a duty to do something, to not just sit around, but actually do something. And an example would be if you see someone drowning in a river, you have a positive duty, positive obligation to go and try to help them if you can. However, there are also negative duties, and those actually can be satisfied by sitting around and proverbially doing nothing. In this case, not drowning someone would be a good example. So it's not permissible to actually drown someone. And I think you also will agree with me that negative duties mostly outweigh the positive ones. So once again, with the example of drowning, it's morally worse to cause someone to drown than not help them. Both are morally wrong, but one, going against your negative duty and actually drowning someone is worse than going against your positive duty and just not helping them. Both are wrong, but one is worse than the other in this view. And obviously the duties can clash, as in this case, as in the case of the trolley problem. There is a duty to help others. So in this case, we should help someone who is drowning, or help the persons who are tied to the tracks, the 5 who need our help. But there is also a negative duty of not leading to the death of someone. In this case, that would be a negative duty that would prohibit us from pulling the lever. It's similar to the distinction between doing versus allowing. So obviously doing something is like a positive duty, and allowing is just not intervening in the course of things. And that would correspond to pulling the lever versus not pulling the lever, just allowing the things to play out as they are about to. And also a distinction between acts and omissions. So it's according to this school of thought, it's worse to lead to the same action if you act to bring it about versus if you omit, forget to do something, ignore to do something, and that would lead to the same consequences. Okay. However, that discussion that we just had only links to this basic conceptualization of the trolley problem. And as we saw in the beginning, this simple example, originally introduced by philosopher in 1967, has spawned a whole academic mini industry, meaning that there are books, articles, thousands of articles maybe even written about the subject, and there are many variations of the problem. One of the most famous ones, to which we'll link also when we discuss the statistical results across different countries in a few slides, is called the Fatman problem. And in a Fatman problem, you are faced with a comparable scenario in the sense that there are 5 people tied to the tracks and the train is heading towards them. But in this instance, you are not located next to a lever. You are standing on a footbridge over the tracks, and there is a fat man standing there watching the train. And you know that if you push that man over the bridge, he will fall on the tracks and the train will hit him, but it will stop as a result. So that person will be sacrificed, but the train will be stopped and the 5 people will survive. So the consequences are the same, right? 5 people are saved versus 1 is saved. But as we'll see, the moral principles involved in it and actually the responses of people who are faced with this problem are quite different. In a similar but slightly more practical scenario, not involving some imaginary trains and tracks, we have a transplant problem in which you are not standing next to the tracks, you are standing in a hospital and you are a doctor that has 5 patients who badly need organ transplant in order to survive. And a completely healthy patient comes to you, and you know that he or she has 5 healthy organs that, in theory, you could harvest from her and give to your 5 dying patients, that's saving their lives. It's, again, when thinking only about the consequences, the same issue. 5 lives saved versus 1 saved, or at least not taken away. So in theory, again, we'll discuss whether that's a valid proposition. In theory, if you decided to pull the lever in the original trolley problem, you should decide to sacrifice 1 life also in those 2 scenarios. You should decide to push the fat man. You should decide to harvest the organs from the healthy patient that's completely innocent in order to save 5 lives, because 5 is greater than the 1. But I hope that you don't agree that this is a good system. And that's not a good system, that's not a good set of principles on which to build a society. And now let's discuss why this is not the case. Well, in order to do that, let's refer to one more great philosopher from the Middle Ages this time. St. Thomas Aquinas was a Franciscan friar living in the 13th century. And he is credited with developing this doctrine of double effect, although he probably never intended it to be used in this way, because the principles that came to be called the doctrine of double effect were first employed by him to justify self-defense. In Christianity, he was a friar, a priest, as you will recall. In Christianity, as in most other cultures, it's not permissible to kill someone for basically no reason. Whether it's out of spite, whether it's out of revenge, whether it's in anger. No, the only exception to that is in self-defense. And that exception actually persists in legislation until this very day. All right, so why is it permissible to do that, whereas it's not permissible to kill in any other instance? Well, the doctrine of double effect asks us to consider whether something is an end in itself or whether it's just a means to an end. So, and whether we intend to bring a specific consequence, or whether we may foresee that it may happen. So, in all those instances, self-defense, the transplant problem, and the Fatman problem, we actually need the bad action to take place. We need the person to fall down on the tracks. We need to take organs from this very patient. We cannot defend ourselves in any other way than by hurting our attacker. And this is the means to achieve an end. Whereas in the basic trolley problem, we don't really need the one person who is tied on a separate track to die. If we divert the train, and that person in the meantime manages to free himself and run away, we're okay with that. We don't need him to die. We mainly foresee that it will happen, but it's not needed for us to achieve the end that we have. And the end that we have is to save the 5. However, we need to push the fat man onto the tracks, knowing that it will be lethal for him, in order to achieve our end. In the same way, we need to harvest the organs from this patient who needs them to live in order to save our 5. So the bad action is actually intended. It needs to happen in order to achieve our end. And this is why, in those instances, way fewer people normally agree that saving 5 lives is worth of performing this heinous action of actually pushing someone over the ledge or harvesting organs from a healthy patient. Although we are not perhaps employing a formal reasoning of this type, this is the distinction that philosophers drew between intending an action that's bad in order to achieve some end that might be good, versus just foreseeing that action will happen. It might happen, but we don't need it to happen in order to achieve the same end. Intention in the action is actually quite an important consideration. It often comes up in court. The question that court often faces is not only whether the accused person did something, but also whether they intended to do it. There is also an interesting phenomenon in the sphere of ethics, of morality, known as Knobs effect. And it says that people are much more likely to ascribe intention to negative things than to positive things. So basically, we are much quicker, much easier to blame someone than to praise someone. In one of the scenarios used to test this Knobs effect on how we value the intention of different actions, the respondents are presented with 2 scenarios. In both, they're the vice president of a company, and they are approached by a board member who says that they have a new project. But in one case, the board member says that the project will harm the environment. The CEO responds, I don't care about harming the environment, I just want to make as much profit as possible. The program is started and the environment was harmed. In the second scenario, the project is set to increase the profits, but help the environment along the way. The chairman's response is the same way. He doesn't care about the environment. The project goes forward and the environment is helped. And in this scenario, if I remember correctly, 82% of people ascribed blame in the first scenario to the CEO. They blame him for intending to harm the environment, whether around only 20% of people ascribe an intent to him in the second scenario. So in the second scenario, the environment was not intended to be helped, it just happened. Whereas, although the scenario is equivalent, apart from the environmental consequences, people assign a clear intention of harming an environment in the first case. Which it's quite an interesting phenomenon, which I thought I would share when discussing the intention behind an action. Okay. So for the sake of time, let's avoid complicating the matter even further, and let's quickly look at the statistical results of how people think about those issues across different countries and cultures. In this case, the data comes from a paper by Awad and his co-authors from 2020, and they did a lot of interesting studies. Actually, we'll see one more example in a moment of a study done by them. But in this instance, they survey around 70,000 people, so much fewer than the 4 million that we saw in the start, and where 72% decided to pull the lever rather than do nothing. In this instance, they are interviewing just 70,000 people. That is still a lot, and they are actually doing it across 42 countries, allowing us to compare whether those cultural attitudes differ. They test 3 scenarios across those populations. First is the switch scenario, which is just the name for the classical trolley problem. Either you pull the lever or not. And you can see by looking at the green dots in the plot below that around 80% across most countries tend to switch, tend to pull the lever in order to sacrifice 1 life for the sake of sparing the 5. The only difference that we see is in East Asian countries. On the very right, you see Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China, Singapore too, where this percentage is lower, although still hovering around 70% for most of those countries. So there is quite a clear argument that the lever should be pulled in this instance. When you look at two other scenarios, the rates of agreement drop somewhat, but not so evidently in the loop scenario. So the loop scenario, that's one we haven't discussed, but it's similar to the Fatman problem, which is the footbridge problem here on the very right hand side. In the loop scenario, you divert the track, you also pull the lever, you don't push anyone. You pull the lever, but you pull it to the track that then joins with the original track. So the person that's on the other track needs to be hit by the train in order to stop the train, because if that person escapes for some reason, then the train goes back to the original track and still hits the 5. So in this case, the doctrine of double effect would say that we shouldn't pull the lever because we need the person on the other track to actually be hit. If he or she was run away, then our end, which is saving 5 people, wouldn't be achieved. So we need something bad to happen in order to achieve our goal, which makes this action, well, at least morally dubious, if not outrightly wrong. And if you were presented with this scenario, then in most cultures, the rates of agreement that the lever should be pulled drop, but not significantly so, by around 5 to 10 percentage points. Not even that much. They remain almost unchanged in some countries like Singapore or Korea. And finally, there's a footbridge problem, which is our Fatman problem, just named differently. And you can see that from the moral standpoint of intention and foreseeing the things or doing something wrong versus refraining from doing something wrong, this is pretty much equivalent to the loop problem. You need the one person to be sacrificed in order to save many. There's no other way. However, in this instance, most people are much more wary to sacrifice one life to save the 5. The rates of agreement drop to around 50%. So basically, every second person is okay with pushing the Fatman. Every second person is not okay with that. So there must be something that people see in those issues that makes them qualitatively different. Pushing someone over the bridge, that's sacrificing him, versus just pulling the lever and sacrificing someone. And you need that person to be sacrificed in both cases. However, there is something, probably the physicality of the act itself, the physicality of touching someone and pushing them over the edge is much more reprehensible to people than the situation in the loop scenario where you only need to pull the lever, thus making the act itself much more impersonal. It's actually quite an important distinction also from the practical standpoint, although not so much related to the trolley problem itself, because the physicality of an act, of something that's bad, physicality of a bad act is quite important. For instance, when considering the drone warfare, you've probably heard that increasingly autonomous drones are being used in warfare nowadays in Ukraine, but for a long time, it was mainly discussed in the context of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this impersonality of waging a warfare from basically a secure location, often from a air-conditioned room somewhere in the States, and flying those drones and deciding on the matters of life or death, is much more impersonal than the act of actually being on the ground and fighting with the enemy. And you can see that people seem to be judging the reprehensibility of a wrong act very differently, where there's something physical involved in the act, whereas it's impersonal, like pulling the lever or pushing a controller on a system that control the drones. So this distinction between physicality of an act versus impersonality of it is quite important and more consideration that also is studied in context of, for instance, modern warfare. So finally, in the first section, let's quickly deal with the practicality of a trolley problem. So we discussed some moral principles and how broad moral principles can be applied to help us decide what is the right choice in the case of trolleys. Why does it matter in practical life, or does it even? Well, first of all, it happens. The trolleys can kill people. For instance, the famous architect Antoni Gaudi, who designed, among others, the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, was actually killed by a train. So it's not a silly question. Trolleys can be lethal, but more importantly, there are actually instances where people are faced with a dilemma that's as similar to the trolley problem as possible in real life. One of the most famous cases is a case of Union Pacific freight car incident that occurred in Los Angeles in 2003. On that day, there was this freight train that missed its turn and was heading down straight to LA docks, where also a Metrolink passenger car was located. And there was, if it was allowed to continue its course, it would smash into that place and lead to significant damage, probably also many deaths because of the presence of the passenger train and also many workers on the site. There was only one possibility to avoid that from happening, and that was diverting the train into a different track that was going through a residential neighborhood. However, that track was designed for much slower trains. Given the speed on which this Union Pacific freight train was traveling, it was almost certain that the train would derail if it was diverted. However, it wasn't so sure that so many people would be harmed, although since this was a residential neighborhood, there was a non-zero likelihood that this will happen. So the dispatchers who had to make this decision relatively quickly were faced with a very similar choice to the trolley problem. Either they do nothing and they allow the train to go straight ahead, probably leading to significant damage, or they actually do something. They willingly act and divert the train, risking that it will do some damage on the other track, although the damage would probably be much less significant. What they did, they diverted the train, and it did cause damage to several houses and also minor injuries to, sorry, I forgot, 13 people, I believe, including a pregnant woman who was only able to avoid more serious injuries by escaping through the window. And you have a picture from the scene of how it looks like. So that's definitely a situation where someone could be significantly harmed or even killed. But still, the decision probably was good because only minor injuries were sustained and a much greater crash was avoided. It's obviously a rare instance where we are faced with something so resembling of a trolley problem, but I wanted really to discuss with you that example because it shows that situations in which the same principles or even very similar decisions present themselves to us. Much more common is and will become even more so in the future a situation where it's the machine that has to decide what to do or not. The principles that we discussed, whether you should sacrifice 1 versus 5, whether you should positively do something versus not do something, refrain from an action, will be taken in the future by the machines. Most importantly, probably the self-driving cars. And obviously the principles involved here, like saving 1 versus 5 lives, are, well, say relatively simple, but there are much more decisions that will need to be programmed into those machines in order for them to, well, we can say act morally, or, well, more like behave in a way that our society will accept and behave in a way in which we'll be comfortable with on a daily basis. And there are many of those decisions involved. And what people think about the decisions that should be taken in each scenario was also tested by Awad and his co-authors in the moral machine experiment. I think you had a link to that in your preparation materials. And basically, this is another large-scale survey in where online volunteers are asked many different scenarios about how a self-driving car should behave in different scenarios. In this case, there are 4 people not driving, but being in an autonomous vehicle that heads straight to 4 people that are crossing using the pedestrian crossing. However, if you look close enough, they're crossing on a red light. Right? So the decision here is whether the car should stay on its course and hit those people, or whether you should swerve in the last minute, hitting a concrete barrier, probably killing, in this case, definitely killing everyone on board of the car. Well, once again, there are many things, many considerations to be made here. What are the passengers on the car more worthy than the people on the crossing? Are the people crossing less worthy of saving because they are crossing on the red light? And there are many different choices, many different scenarios that they test here. And those are the results from thousands, if not millions, of responses that they got. So in this case, you compare a couple of different binary choices. So for instance, whether there's preference in a given society to make the car swerve or stay on track, whether there's to spare the passengers or the pedestrians, males versus females, or obese people versus lean people, poor people versus rich people, those who are lawful versus unlawful, elderly and young, whether to spare many people or fewer people, and whether to spare pets versus humans. And obviously, as you can see, those examples get progressively, well, let's say clearer, in the sense that people are expressing much stronger preference for saving humans versus pets, and also sparing more people versus sparing fewer, and also sparing the young versus sparing the elderly. But as we go up the graph here, the preference is much smaller. For instance, preference between pedestrians and passengers is relatively minuscule. This is an important thing because it's important exercise, in my view, because some of the moral principles that we discuss, utilitarianism versus deontology, whether negative duties are more important than positive ones, they are debatable, let's say. Philosophers have been debating those issues for ages, and many reasonable people can disagree on which obligation takes precedence over another. And this will happen in many real-life scenarios, which are inherently more complex than the problems that the philosophers conceive. That's why it's so important to study what are the popular preferences of people for those actions, because it will help us to design those systems in a way that feels just and feels acceptable to everyone. And in a democratic society, I hope you will agree with me again that it's a choice that should be much more taken by the people rather than the philosophers. Philosophers in academic departments just debating those sometimes obtuse principles of deontology, consequentialism, and so on. So this is a way to making in this case, autonomous system of self-driving cars much more democratic in its design, obviously, if those principles are acted upon by the companies producing them. One more practical example, again from the warfare discipline, might be a choice faced by Churchill during Second World War. So back then, Churchill was facing many very important choices, but one of them was reminiscent of the trolley problem too. So he knew that the V1 rockets that were falling on London back then were not hitting were hitting the central places in London, the most important ones. But he knew that he could feed intelligence to the Germans that would divert the rockets into less crucial places away from central London towards the south. And the choice was whether to do that, that's sparing the central London, but sacrificing some people living in those places on which the rockets would fall, versus not doing so. He opted for doing so after all, but this is once again reminiscent of the trolley problem, because it's not doing something leading to greater damage versus doing something and leading to smaller yet still significant damage. Since I want leave some possibility for questions, let me quickly skip through the rest of that. The trolley problem also occurs quite frequently in healthcare. For instance, when it comes to drug funding, there are many instances where there is limited funding for drug research, and you can either continue researching the drugs that will help only the minority of people, or or help the greater majority of people, but it would require changing in which agencies are funded and how the money is dispersed. In an emergency room, you also have to decide who to help, right? In the same way as in the virtual machine scenarios that we saw. In emergency room, the first responders, the doctors, are often faced with a choice: should we save the elderly woman, or should we save the young obese person? Say, should we save the child, or should we save the adult? And those are the moral choices and moral dilemmas that need to be solved on a daily basis. And finally, the principles that we're discussing also allowed us to say something about the rationale for things like banning the torture or prohibition on killing, because they allow us to think about those actions. We used the case of torturing before, to think about them not just in terms of the immediate consequences, but also in terms of the action being right or wrong on its own, and establishing a precedence that might be bad going forward. That's all that I had for today. Sorry for rushing through a couple of the last slides. I always have a bit too much of the examples to discuss with you. I wanted to take the last 5 minutes to answer any questions that you might have. Once again, I think you are not allowed to turn on your microphone in this setting, but please do write them in the chat if you have some questions. Oh yeah, in myself, I would pull the lever, I think. Thank you so much for participating too. Yeah, and answering the question that was posted, I think I would pull the lever. In this instance, I would say that I'm quite convinced by the utilitarian thinking that 5 lives is more than 1. I'm actually, yeah, without there being some clear social consequences of my action, like in the case of, for instance, the transplant situation, where it's very bad practice for doctors to adopt to kill alive patients in order to save the dying ones. I think in the trolley scenario is I don't know, by its construction is less. Seems to be less consequential from the societal standpoint. And I believe, for instance, if we go back to the practical examples of it, like the Union Pacific freight train, we would also judge it in real life to be the case. Like if those dispatchers hadn't diverted the train, but allowed it to continue its course, thus leading to much greater injuries, possibly even some deaths, then we would judge them much more harshly than we do now when they diverted the train, thus avoiding a major disaster. So it seems to play out in practice quite well. Any more questions?
Just give it a second. I guess there was typing, I think, Robert. But that was really interesting. It's really like just listening in the background. I'm a big sucker for philosophy, so it's fascinating to listen as you talk through all this stuff. I can see you've had a lot of questions as you go through, and I'm just giving it a chance in case there are any more. But yeah, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you all for your questions. The discussion's been really good. I've noticed there's quite a few of like people having quite interesting comments and discussion as we go through, so that's always really nice to see.
Yep, thank you so much.